Welcome to Whiskey Cast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie, and this is episode number 1110 for May 26th, 2025. Coming up in a few minutes.
We are approaching Texan climate as an ingredient in our whiskey. So just as your grain or your cask is, it's like the way we use our climate here is part of what will create extra flavors or different flavors.
We talk about hot climates, namely Texas, maybe India, Taiwan, as being these really intense places that get a lot more flavor out of the barrel faster. And this is like an old kind of trope that we're hoping to kind of shed more light on.
We know that Texas has its own unique climate for maturing whiskey, but how does that climate affect maturation? This week we're going to nerd out with two Texas distilleries that have been experimenting to find the differences between whiskey matured in Texas and the same whiskey matured somewhere else. Milam and Greene split the same bourbon distillate between Texas and Kentucky, while Balcones sent its single malt and barrels to be aged in Washington, Kentucky, and Scotland. We'll get the results of those experiments on this week's Whiskey Cast in depth. I'll also taste the results of the Milam and Greene experiments in the What I'm Tasting This Week department, and we'll have Behind the Label and much more. The news is next on this week's Whiskey Cast.
Hello, Gabriel Cardarella for Jewers. The 2025 release of our Jewers 19-Year-Old Champions Edition is a masterpiece, crafted for those who appreciate the finer things, whether on the course or in a glass. More on that in a moment.
Let's begin with the news. It's brought to you by the Dalmore. U.S. President Donald Trump is talking tariffs again after first threatening to raise the tariff on European Union imports from 10 to 50% heading into the holiday weekend. Trump backed off Sunday and delayed the tariffs until July 9th. He said the EU has not been negotiating in good faith, but he's allowing more time for talks to take place. The move came following a phone call between Trump and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen. Negotiators for both sides are expected to meet in Paris next month. A 50% tariff would hurt Irish whiskey exports to the U.S., which is the largest single market for Irish whiskies. Diageo is projecting tariffs could cost the world's largest alcohol company $150 million a year. That's down from the $200 million it had projected for the second half of the fiscal year, as the company's Canadian whiskey and tequila exports to the U.S. have not been hit with tariffs. Both are covered by the U.S.-Canada-Mexico trade agreement that exempts them from tariffs. Diageo executives announced a plan to cut $500 million in costs and sell off substantial assets to turn around its finances. Another U.S. craft distiller has been sold. This time it's the Brooklyn-based New York Distilling Company, which has been sold to Scotland's Loch Lomond Group. The buyers plan to invest in expanding distillation and production capacity at the distillery, along with improving the visitor experience and adding its whiskies to Loch Lomond's global distribution network. No purchase price was disclosed, and Loch Lomond did not make anyone available for interviews. Constellation Brands has handed control of Belle Meade whiskey back to the Nelson brothers, Charlie and Andy. Constellation acquired the brand when it bought stakes in Nelson's Greenbrier Distillery in 2016 and assumed majority ownership in 2019. The brothers told Whiskey Advocate they intend to keep Belle Meade as a Nashville and Tennessee-focused whiskey brand going forward, using whiskey sourced from MGP and Bardstown Bourbon Company. Whiskey Advocate also reports Constellation has cut the production schedule and laid off staff at the Nashville distillery, though the restaurant, bar, tours, and tastings remain open for business. International Beverage faces strikes by its workers starting next week after a breakdown in contract talks. Unions representing workers at its 5 distilleries and the Airdrie Maturation and Blending Facility near Glasgow plan 6 days of strikes starting June 2nd. The strikes come as the company has just completed an upgrade to its warehousing capacity. The maker of Inverhouse Scotch spent around $9 million to build 6 new warehouses at the Airdrie campus. The new warehouses will hold 60,000 barrels or so and will mature whiskey distilled at Balblair, Old Pulteney, Speyburn, Knockdhu, and Balmenic. Gordon and MacPhail is starting the search for a new CEO following Philip White's announcement that he will be leaving the family-owned company after a little more than a year on the job. He'll be moving to the south of England for family reasons. Chairman Neil Urquhart will serve as acting CEO. Memorial Day is a day to honor those who sacrificed their lives in wartime, and we have several brands releasing special bottles this holiday weekend. Uncle Nearest celebrated its annual Honor Day Saturday with a special single-barrel release available only at the distillery in Shelbyville, Tennessee. Green River has unveiled a special bottling to celebrate the U.S. Army's 250th anniversary. The bourbon will be available starting June 14th, and part of the proceeds will go to military charities. And Minnesota's Brother Justice Distillery is releasing a new whiskey made in collaboration with the 34th Infantry Division Association. Commander's Own is an American whiskey made with 100% malted barley, and part of the proceeds will support the nonprofit group's programs. Other new releases of note this week: Michter's is releasing a new batch of its 10-year-old Kentucky Straight Rye in June. The single-barrel whiskey will carry a recommended retail price of $210 a bottle. Baltimore's Sagamore Spirit Distillery has released a new batch of its 7-year-old cask-strength rye whiskey. It blends the distillery's high rye and low rye whiskeys. It'll be available nationwide for $69.99 a bottle. Rebel Bourbon has teamed up with NASCAR team owner Richard Childress's winery to create a new Cabernet Franc finished version Rebel 100 bourbon. The whiskey is available exclusively at North Carolina ABC stores and at the Lux Row Distillery in Bardstown, Kentucky for $39.99 a bottle. Woodford Reserve has released the latest edition in its distillery series of limited edition releases. It's a tawny port-finished bourbon that will be available at the distillery and select Kentucky retailers for $64.99 a bottle. I received a sample this week, and I'll have my tasting notes for it later on. Scotland's Ardnamurchan Distillery is out with batch number 2 of the Midgie. It's a port cask finished single malt that is the distillery's first whiskey to use port casks. It's available for £54 a bottle through the Spirits Embassy and other specialist retailers in the UK. And Australia's Sullivan's Cove Distillery is now making some of its whiskies available at the distillery shop in Hobart, Tasmania, and through the distillery's website. The range includes Sullivan's Cove Double Cask and selected French Oak and American Oak single-barrel bottlings. Finally, Buffalo Trace has launched an online auction and sweepstakes to raise money for victims of the state's recent severe storms. The Pour It Forward for Kentucky fundraiser features several rare auction items, including a complete Pappy Van Winkle collection. The auction and sweepstakes runs through June 5th, and we have a link for more details in the show notes for this episode at whiskycast.com. That's also where you can keep up to date on whiskey news all week long. The news is brought to you by the Dalmore.
Hello, Richard Patterson here, Master Distiller, Master Blender for the Dalmore. You know, whenever the team and I are in the world sharing our exceptional single malt, we like to keep in touch with Mark Gillespie and the latest news from Whiskey Cast.
Let's check the calendar now and see what's happening around the world of whiskey. The Islay Festival of Malt and Music continues all week long on Islay. Hard to Find Whiskey has an Ardbeg tasting on Thursday night in Birmingham, England, and the Whiskey Exchange has a tasting of Islay whiskies that same night at its London Bridge shop in London. Ardbeg has tastings all over the world in the coming days for Ardbeg Day this Saturday, including one at Stone Street in New York City on Saturday. The Whiskey Lounge hosts a tasting of whiskies from independent bottlers June 7th at the Seven Oaks in Manchester, England. The Silicon Valley Whiskey Festival takes place on the 8th in San Carlos, California, and the Washington Nationals host a Buffalo Trace dinner in the bullpen at Nationals Park on the 12th in Washington, D.C. If you're organizing a whiskey festival, let us know about it. We'll add it to the calendars at whiskycast.com and in the WhiskyCast community app.
Dewar's 19-year-old Champions Edition is more than just exceptional whiskey. It's a tribute to the U.S. Open Championship. Each year's limited edition release is crafted to honor the host course, integrating its spirit through a unique cask finish. For the 2025 tournament at Oakmont in Pennsylvania, Dewar's continues this tradition with an exceptional 19-year-old whiskey, double-aged, then finished in a way that nods to Pennsylvania's long-standing connection to apple brandy. Created by six-time Master Blender of the Year Stephanie McLeod, this year's edition is finished in Calvados apple brandy casks, imparting layers of green apples, apricots, citrus, warm spice, and a touch of honey. This isn't just a tribute, it's a masterclass in blending. Seek it out, savor every drop, and trust me, you'll be glad you did. Please enjoy responsibly. Copyright 2025, Dewar's is a trademark. Imported by John Dewar & Sons Company, Coral Gables, Florida. Blended Scotch whiskey, 43% alcohol by volume.
This week on WhiskeyCast In Depth, we're going to look at a pair of experiments designed to study the influence of climate on maturation, specifically the Texas climate. In just a few minutes, we'll look at the Balcones distilling study that compared its single malt maturing in 4 different locations. But first, Milam and Greene in Blanco, Texas, is releasing The Answer this week. It's a 2-bottle set of bourbons matured in Texas and Kentucky. The base whiskeys for both were identical, and the only difference was the climate. Heather Greene asked the question, shortly after becoming the CEO and master blender at Milam and Greene, what difference does the Texas climate make when it comes to maturing a whiskey?
Mark, this was probably one of the most intriguing, fun, exciting things I've been a part of in whiskey. So, as you know, you and I were just chatting about how long we've known each other, and then we were both in whiskey before that. And so this to me was just, being able to create experiment like this is just super cool. So, when I came down to Texas, there were a lot of people who were like, what are you doing there? You're blending and batching, different ages, some people were, I know behind the scenes, like, she's nuts. She's going from here to there. What's she doing in Texas? The first thing we did, though, Marlene and I and the team, was lay down barrels both in Kentucky and at our distillery in the middle of Hill Country, Texas. And so many people were like, oh, Texan whiskey is this, Texan whiskey is that. It's hot, it's spicy, it's undrinkable. I mean, there were just all these myths and theories. And we wanted to get at the heart of like, well, what is it exactly? We don't know. And the best way we could figure out at the time how to do that, and this was, before the pandemic even, was we separated some barrels at birth out of the column still in Kentucky. So Marlene, our first fill that we laid down up in Kentucky, Marlene, as you know, Marlene and I go there with our own mash bill, our own yeast recipe, all of our specs. We do it up there with the teams up there. And we brought half of them immediately to Texas. And we just watched what happened over 5 years to really kind of isolate the effects the best we could on climate to move that conversation forward so that we could test everyone's hypothesis. And what was interesting to us is, we do talk a lot about hypothesis and guesses like, oh, it does this, whiskey does that. So this is the first time we could really, I think any distillery in the US has been able to really isolate the best we can the effects of climate, take that whiskey distilled out of Kentucky, bring it down here to compare what happens when it's subject to the wily temperatures of Texas. And we're releasing it, and just let's see, there's only 800 cases. That's it. We did a small, actually it's not that small. I mean, it's like 2,400 kits. So, but it was enough for us to see the differences between the two.
And what did you find?
Well, we found that people were correct in their hypothesis that Texas whiskey, I hate to say accelerates aging or all that kind of stuff because, we're putting this value on it or this judgment on it compared to Kentucky. Or maybe you could say Kentucky ages slower, or what is accelerated aging, but what we found is indeed there are more of the properties that you find in oak that are more prominent in the Texan whiskey. So the maple, the caramel, the that kind of richness, and also the proof is 116 versus 108. So that alone will really influence how that whiskey ages in a cask.
Interesting that you'd find this because I'm also going to run an interview with some guys from Balcones that they did a similar experiment where they took their single malt distillate and put it in 4 different places in Scotland, Washington State, Kentucky, and Texas. And they got similar results to what you found.
Yeah. Okay. So we're excited. How old is their whiskey? Did they say?
They did 4 years.
Okay, same. We're actually more closer to 5. But yeah, so I announced I think yeah, 219, 2021, 2, 3. We're close to 6, so we're about 4.5, 5.5 in. So pretty exciting. And really for the bourbon industry, this should be, especially in Texas, which is a new quote unquote hotspot for whiskey, literally and figuratively, I guess. This is really exciting to us. It's also, for me, it also validates what we came down here to do as a team with Marlene, myself, Marcia, Rick, who runs our distillery, like these people that believe in this method of making whiskey that we do, which is we blend, batch, and we age different ages and different distillate from primarily these 2 states. We have this amazing Hall of Famer Kentucky distiller, and it makes sense that she would go home at her second home now. Well, actually, I don't know what's her home, first or Texas or Kentucky, but she might argue with that. But and distill in both and have those as ingredients to make the best whiskey we can. Because what it did for me was just basically validate this method of whiskey making, which is you have this wonderful grain to glass with more of your higher proof, your oak properties, really giving that personality to a whiskey. But we also have, very traditional Kentucky bourbon on offer as well. Most of everything we do at Milam and Greene, Texas touches it, whether it's that climate or the actual ingredients itself out of our pot still. It always becomes an ingredient. And this really underpinned that, like the ingredient is real. And when you take that Kentucky whiskey, so if the notes out of the Texan whiskey we saw had more of those oak properties, the Kentucky whiskey has more of the esters, right? So more esterification. So you have more fruits and florals, and it's a little, maybe a little more grain forward at 4 years old. But when you put them together, you get a better 4-year-old whiskey, we find, than if either of them were just on their own. That's what, are different incarnations, different personalities, but I really enjoy them together. And that's really what we do at Milam and Greene. Our triple cask is 3 different whiskeys blended together, some from Kentucky, some from Texas, in different incarnations. We bring blends down, and then we finish them in oak barrels for our very small batch. And then we also have the pure expressions of what we do in Kentucky for those who want it, and the pure expression of what we do in Texas. So it just creates an exciting array of flavors, but also it's fun for the consumer because they get to see how nature writes itself into the product.
How do you take your findings and use them in whiskey making going forward?
I'm glad you asked. One, I'm not going to change how I make in a lot of ways, like let me know that this is the right path. I think it's more now stabilizing and building. I think it took 6 years to get where we want this product range to be, and it's really taking off. So what this product range is finally, it's our own aged distillate in Kentucky. It's our aged distillate in Texas. It's our own innovations in the cask finishing and how we do that. So I would say now it's just trying to get more people to love and embrace the whiskey house that we've become.
What else are you working on?
So we are working on some other projects that really that highlight what you were talking about. Like, what else are we doing? The combination of Texas and Kentucky. So we do have more products coming out that, really we're approaching Texan climate as an ingredient in our whiskey. So just as your grain or your cask is, it's like the way we use our climate here is part of what will create extra flavors or different flavors. So we are increasing capacity and doubling down more on our findings and how we make our whiskey because people seem to like it. So we're pretty excited. But as I said, it's like for us, it's really, and thanks to you and people like you, trying to get more people discovering what it is we do. We've worked really hard to create what it is we've created. And now it's about bringing people in, bringing more people to connect with the work that we do and the creativity that underlies what we do. And we're just really excited for people to share it. I mean, whiskey is something I think we can all agree on and get along with in America. So
one of the few things.
Yeah, exactly. But we're pretty pumped.
The answer goes on sale this week at the Milam and Greene website, the tasting room in Blanco, Texas, and at select retailers. Greene plans to follow up on the experiment by sending some of their Texas pot-distilled whiskey to Kentucky for a similar test. Now, sending Texas whiskey to Kentucky is just part of what Balcones Distilling did. They sent single malt distillate and carefully selected empty barrels to warehouses in Kentucky, Washington State, and Scotland, while keeping some of that same distillate behind in Texas. Jared Himstedt is the head distiller, and Gabe Richarde is the head blender at Balcones. They presented their findings at a press tasting in New York City earlier this month, and we sat down for a chat after the tasting. So tell me why you guys decided to do this experiment in the first place.
Originally, we hadn't even considered that it would be of interest to other distilleries or industry folks. It was mostly we wanted more hard info on what Texas was doing to kind of complement all the qualitative stuff that we had already been experiencing for over a decade. And I think for me personally, the advent of other hot climate whiskeys, as soon as like Cavalan started winning awards and all these other things started happening with people working with similar conditions, it felt more and more relevant as we went on to find out how that maturation climate was contributing, to this black box of an experiment of making whiskey in places where it historically hasn't been made.
Gabe, explain how you set up the experiment.
Yeah, so we took 100% malted barley, so a single malt new make made at Balcones, and we sent that in totes as new make to 4 different locations. There's actually 6, but for the nature of the study, for the presentation that you saw, Mark, it was 4, and we sent them those totes along with 5 barrels to 4 different locations. So Washington, Texas, obviously, Kentucky, and then a partner in Scotland. And on the same day in October 2019, we all put the new make at 120 proof into these 5 barrels, and then every year we would pull samples in October and send them off to ISC, our cooperage partner, for GCMS analysis to kind of tell us what was happening to the oak flavor compounds.
And what did you find?
A little bit surprising. We found that the top end temperatures and the low end temperatures made a big difference. We also found that the swings made a big difference. So the temperature variation was a major factor. Just kind of how consistent, or in our case, how inconsistent the climate was, and kind of that cycling. The classic. Hearing people over the years saying this whiskey needs another summer. Well, for us, that could be like 3 weeks from now. It doesn't necessarily mean waiting a year for next summer to come. But also the depth of penetration, which has a lot to do, we think, with the top end temperatures, the hottest temperatures, how much the wood grain is opening up and how deep the whiskey is getting. Is it getting past the toasted, the red layer and the char into some unmodified parts of the wood that's still left in the cask? As you saw in the spider plots, a lot of a lot of this understanding or assumption that the same things are going to happen, they're just going to take longer depending on where you are, and finding out that aesthetically we didn't think that was necessarily true, but having harder data to go to kind of corroborate that sense that it's not just more or less of a thing depending on the temperature, it's actually different things are getting accentuated.
Because the spider plot, if it had been equal, would have shown a similar plot for all the whiskeys, just at different levels. And it really didn't, did it?
Yeah.
No, yeah, we found in the colder climates, so what we're calling the cooler climates, Washington, Kentucky, and Scotland, they preferred the sugary compounds from the wood sugars, from hemicellulose degradation byproducts from toasting and charring. Whereas Texas, the hot climate, sample in this experiment, it preferred the lignin degradation byproducts, so spice and vanilla and smoke, and also lactone, so like that fresh oak character, but it ignored the sugary products. It ignored the hemicellulose, which we would expect based off of where those reside from a toast and a char. It'd be shallow, but the Texas climate really just kind of went out of its way to not intake them. And so that was a real conundrum for us. And it's something that we'll explore later to see in a second stage of the experiment, like why exactly did that happen. But it really starts to set the stage for, as coopers, as distillers, like understanding what these distinct climates can do and how we need to adjust our process if we want different outcomes.
How do you take this and make it a real-world application?
Yeah, it's tricky. I think if there's value to other distilleries to understanding what the climate will do, given a certain type of cask, giving a certain type of spirit, giving a certain entry proof, there is the potential to have somebody like Independent Stave customize how they're processing and treating your barrel. They can help you avoid some pitfalls of your area, or you can really accentuate and like lean into some things that where you are in the world, this climate loves to already do X. So what input, what new make do you give it, so that when you get it back out of the cask and you harvest those years later, that you're getting something that is maybe more balanced or maybe less balanced. I mean, whatever, there's a wide range of what people like to make and what people like to drink. But I think just like distilleries have been learning for the last 10, 15, 20 years in the U.S., that there's some levers that can be pulled and manipulated to affect spirit that aren't necessarily techniques employed in some of the traditional whiskey-making regions like Kentucky and Scotland. I think there's some potential for barrel manufacturing and processing. There's levers there that I don't know that we've been pulling to really kind of customize where you want to send this thing without manipulating your climate. Still treating your climate respectfully. I'm here. It's a partner in the process. I'm not trying to ask Central Texas to not be Central Texas, but how do I give it something different if I want to get something different back?
How do you get the sweetness to come back into your barrels in Texas, considering that the sugar content was minimal? And you want that sweetness for balance.
Yeah. I mean, it's tricky if we're right that some of that is a byproduct of the whiskey getting past the toast and char layers into unmodified oak layers. You can only toast so deep before you start getting into structural integrity problems with the stave thickness. But that's one option. That's at least a hypothesis. You could be do longer, slower toasts that get deeper, and so the whiskey, even as it opens, it's still staying in some caramelized layers. I don't know. I mean, there's so many questions. I joked about it all night, but I think a good research project should leave you with. You started with one or two questions, and now we have like 12, and so the next round should be more informative and should be more tailored fit to actually. Less just academic knowledge and application, at least for us. I know we're going to look at the next round of trials to actually play with things that we would like to do and not just to have general knowledge,
Gabe?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we've been doing in-house is we've dropped our entry proof by about 10 proof over the last, 4 or 5 years. Slowly, but we've settled closer to 112 to 115 as opposed to 120 to 125. And then another kind of approach that we've taken is, experimenting with the difference between extra fine versus fine grain. Starting with less flavor extractives in general, so that we can more balance the spirit over time in maturation in Texas, or thinner stave versus thick stave. We were doing thin stave in Texas for a while. We've experimented with some thicker stave, but maybe a thinner stave actually has less unmodified wood for the spirit to go into, to retrieve some of the more intense Texas-y character from. And so it's been a lot. And one of the big takeaways is, as soon as we started getting the initial results, we modified our toast profiles to, if we had like a 90-minute toast that hit specific temperature and time curves, we would ask ISC, hey, give us the exact same shape of the toast and char profile, but cut it to 45 minutes instead of 90. Let's reduce the overall impact of this. So we're trying and experimenting with some things, but we're in the early stages. I mean, we just got the results like within the last year and a half. So we've got a lot more work to do.
So let's talk about water and alcohol solubility, because that's the key thing in terms of maturation, in terms of getting the whiskey into the wood.
Yeah, I think another control that we did not think ahead far enough to control for with this round of trials is that which compounds are more alcohol and water soluble, and entry proof being a big component in that. Humidity in the environment, if you're taking on water or you're losing water. But yeah, that seems like another area that playing with that as you're playing with barrel variables for any given climate, it seems like another way to kind of like hack the system a little bit and kind of maximize and minimize whatever it is that you're trying to do. Yeah, there's so many. It's a really, like most things whiskey related, there's so many variables. You kind of have to pare it down and pick a few and control for everything else, just so you have some result that's not just anecdotal. It's like any maturation related trials. The cool thing is, as I'm getting close to 50, it's like there's easily 16 to 20 more years of this if you're waiting 4 to 6 years to get feedback results from these things, which is exciting to me. We're not going to run out of things to like continue to try and chase down, and that's just one avenue. That's just one of the major pillars of whiskey making.
It's just one rabbit hole to go down.
Yeah.
Was there anything that surprised you in the findings?
I was surprised that Texas and Kentucky were as different as they were, honestly. Like, we're not as drastic. I mean, you compare Texas to Pacific Northwest or Texas to Scotland, that's pretty drastic. Kentucky to Texas is not, I've got a family that lives in Georgia, and you're 8-10 degrees off on a hot day, cold day, whatever. But for that spider plot with those 7 compounds, for Kentucky to have been as different from Texas as it was surprising. And also the fact that they didn't gain as much proof as I would have expected was also surprising. But some of that's being on the bottom floor. Those are milder, a little more consistent climates anyway. But I would have expected Kentucky to climb and proof just like the Texas samples did. But
it didn't, did it?
No, it pretty much stayed the same. And I guess the Pacific Northwest didn't drop as much as I thought either. Yeah. I expected that to be more like a little bit closer to the Scotch ABV drops, but
I think it always tickles me that, we talk about hot climates, namely Texas, maybe India, Taiwan, as being these really intense places that get a lot more flavor out of the barrel faster. And this is like an old kind of trope that we're hoping to kind of shed more light on, right? But I still love, and I alluded to it in the talk, Mark, was when we look at Scotland, and of all the 4 samples that we looked at, it had the most 5-HMF, the most honeyed character, out of any of the whiskeys, which to me is so funny. It's like, yeah, sure, Texas has more vanilla. It's got more glycol smoke. It's got more eugenol, like baking spice character. But like Scotland is holding its own on kind of what it's known for, like a honeyed grain character. And that to me was, kind of evidence that we're kind of on the right track to some extent. And it still kind of tickles me every time I see it. Like, I forget, I think, oh, Texas makes this huge whiskey, but Scotland does something unique, and Kentucky, Washington, they're all doing something that are emblematic of their climate and making distinct whiskeys. And that it's a good reminder to me every time I do the presentation to be reminded, like they're all doing something that is kind of grounding themselves in a sense of place for that whiskey producing region.
Balcones is not bottling the 4 whiskeys from its experiment. Thanks to Heather Green of Milam and Greene and Jared Himstedt and Gabe Richarde of Balcones Distilling for sharing their findings with us this week on WhiskyCast In Depth. Now, how did the Milam and Greene whiskeys taste? Let's compare them in the What I'm Tasting This Week department, starting with the Kentucky-aged bourbon. It came out at 54.15% ABV, and the nose has a sweet note of caramel, along with dried fruits, honey, vanilla, and soft spices. The taste has black pepper and cinnamon, balanced by apples and dried fruits, a slight floral touch, honey, and vanilla, while the finish is long and well-balanced. Now, the Texas-aged bourbon is bottled at 58.65% ABV and has sweet oak on the nose along with brown sugar, dried fruits, and a hint of honey. The taste starts out creamy at first, before the wood spices take over with hints of apples and honey in the background. The spices last through the finish with a touch of honey. Individually, I scored the Kentucky-aged bourbon a 92 and the Texas-aged one a 91. Now I'll do my own experiment in blending the two together to see what happens. I mentioned the new Woodford Reserve Distillery Series Tawny Port-finished bourbon during the news, and I received a sample this week. It's bottled at the standard Woodford proof of 45.2% ABV, and the nose has notes of toasted coconut, dried fruits, cocoa, honey, and vanilla. The taste has a hint of clove, balanced by baking chocolate, brown sugar, nutmeg, and honey. And the finish is long and slightly spicy, with touches of cocoa powder and baking chocolate underneath. I'm scoring the Woodford Reserve Distillery Series Tawny Port finish a 93. I'll be adding these whiskeys to our searchable list of nearly 3,900 different whiskeys from all over the world. Check it out this week at whiskycast.com. Let's open up the inbox now and see what people are talking about this week in our community segment. I posted a photo of Milam and Greene's The Answer collection on social media earlier this week to promote this episode, and Hugo Dart posted this comment from Brazil in the WhiskyCast community app. I wonder what the experiment might add to the ongoing debate on whiskey terroir. Sticking with the T word for now, Kellyanne Woods chimed in with this comment on LinkedIn. Fascinating project and a great example of how terroir isn't just for wine. The contrast between Texas and Kentucky maturation is a compelling lens through which to explore climate's impact on whiskey flavor, texture, and structure. Thanks, Kellyanne. Had this comment from Highland Hill on last week's interview with Middleton master distiller Kevin O'Gorman. I'm amazed at the complexity of Middleton Very Rare. The 2025 blend seems especially unique. The silent distillery chapters are really intriguing. Don't usually think of Irish blends being 45-plus years old. Now, I should note that the silent distillery chapters were primarily single pot still whiskeys and not blends. If you have something you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, download the free WhiskyCast community app from your app store and join the conversation. You can also find us on X, Blue Sky, Threads, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskyCast, and the email address is comments@whiskycast.com. Let's close out the show now with Behind the Label, our look at the history, science, and people who make whiskey unique. Let's unpack the question of what exactly is a single pot still Irish whiskey. As Kevin O'Gorman told us last week, it's made from a combination of malted and unmalted barley in pot stills, and as with single malt, more than one still can be used at the same distillery. It became popular in the 18th century as a way for Ireland's distillers to get around the malt tax that was in place on malted barley. By mixing malted and unmalted barley, the distillers were able to cut their tax bills while producing a whiskey with a distinct flavor profile. While the style originated in Ireland, and some might say it was perfected there, the method for making single pot still whiskey has been used outside of Ireland. Colorado's Telnua distillery has been making single pot still whiskey for several years, and its Bourbon Cask and Stave Series whiskey recently took top whiskey honors in this year's American Distilling Institute annual competition. If you have something you'd like us to look at on an upcoming episode, just get in touch with us. That's all for this episode of Whiskey Cast. You'll find links for the stories in this episode in our show notes at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find the latest whiskey news, my tasting notes, the calendar of events, the whiskey photo of the week, and, of course, a complete archive of past episodes going all the way back to 2005. Get in touch with us. Download the free Whiskey Cast community app from your app store or find us on social media. We're on Blue Sky, X, Threads, Instagram, and Facebook at WhiskeyCast, and the email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
Discover the 2025 limited release of Dewar's 19-Year-Old Champions Edition, finished in Calvados apple brandy casks, a perfect fusion of craftsmanship and tradition. Here's to great whiskey and the game that inspires it.
Whiskey Cast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2025, and comes to you from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.